Welcome to the only Danish podcast about pro wrestling. And welcome back, Keith Elliot Greenberg. I could probably say a good friend of the podcast and also a good friend of mine because
that would be an accurate thing to say, Nikolai.
Yeah. And it actually is quite a crazy story. On a corner in Los Angeles, we bumped into each other.
Walking around with your son. You were walking around with your son. It was WrestleMania weekend, and we just started talking as we were walking in the street in Los Angeles. And that's how we met each other.
And that's so amazing, actually, looking back at that. And every time when I talk with someone, I tell that story and say, well, that's typical you, Nikolai, that you just bump into someone and then just start talking.
Yeah, I think about that because, I live in New York, and Los Angeles isn't that type of city, really. Like, Copenhagen is certainly, Amsterdam is, New York is, Paris is, London, you're walking around, you see somebody and you get into a conversation. Los Angeles people tend to stay in their cars, but that happened to us. We were walking in downtown Los Angeles and that was how we met each other.
Yeah. And we shared a passion for wrestling.
Yes.
But we're not here to talk about AEW. We're here to talk about your new book. So, you're probably a wrestling historian, a wrestling journalist. I could put a lot of names, award-winning author, everyone. But this one here probably is your newest creation.
Yes. And it's something I'm proud of. No one can deny that this book, first of all, it's a coffee table. So it's a lot of photos. I think some very dramatic behind the scenes photos, some great in-ring stuff. And it's, the text that I wrote is about the first 5 years, how AEW became the phenomena that it is. And whether you are a WWE fan, an AEW fan, or both, as I am, I think it's very important to acknowledge the role that AEW has played in its first 5 years and to this day, because both companies have influenced each other. And no one can pretend that one company just lives in a vacuum and other people aren't watching. And you see the AEW influence in WWE in some of the ways that the matches are presented. I would say certainly WWE the wrestlers always performed at a high athletic level, but AEW blatantly taps into the Japanese style and into the European style and into the Mexican style and embraces it as an equal style to the traditional American style. And I believe that WWE, particularly under Triple H, has begun to do that. And, and likewise, I think that AEW, and no one's ever confirmed this with me, has been influenced by WWE's style of storytelling. So I always say this, 100 years from now, people will look back on this period of wrestling and those first 5 years of AEW will be considered a significant time.
Yeah, and that's one very interesting thing, Keith, because in this episode, we're going to take our listeners on a journey from parking lot deals, getting to know Tony Khan, and finish all the way to Wembley, where we met the second time, actually.
That's right.
So, Keith, could you tell our listeners a little bit about the background story before All Elite Wrestling was founded?
Well, the story really starts with Tony Khan's childhood, which is very intriguing. Now, here's Tony Khan. He loves wrestling. He's obsessed with wrestling, and he's a kid. And so in that way, Tony Khan is very similar to all of us. But there's one major difference. Most of us were not raised by billionaires. Tony Khan's father happens to be Shahid Khan, who I believe is considered the wealthiest Pakistani born man on earth. And he owns Fulham Football Club. He owns the Jacksonville Jaguars in the NFL. And so there were always these resources. I think it was always assumed that Tony would go into the sports management business. And, Tony has certainly contributed quite a bit to Fulham and to the Jacksonville Jaguars. But in terms of passion for wrestling, I don't think any other diversion can even come close to professional wrestling in Tony Khan's mind. And he told me an interesting story. Part of it is in the book. So Tony Khan's father is from Pakistan originally and raised Muslim. And Tony Khan's mother is American from Illinois. And I believe she was raised Lutheran. So Tony Khan was raised Lutheran. And after school, Tony Khan would sometimes be expected to, maybe forced to go to religious instruction at the Lutheran church, and he'd have to sit in the classroom. And, I relate to that because my parents forced me to go to Hebrew school when I was a kid and get bar mitzvah, and I didn't really want to do it, but I couldn't really, they were feeding me and, clothing me, so I had to go along with them. And so Tony Khan wasn't thrilled about being there, so he would sit in the back of the classroom and he would pretend he had his own wrestling promotion. And he would start booking dream matches of his favorite wrestlers, and sometimes with wrestlers from other eras. And he even created his own wrestling TV show. And so there would be storylines and they would be continued the next week. And really, that's what AEW is. It's every child who fantasizes about promoting professional wrestling. This one actually did it. He also happens to have the drive. It's not just the resources, it's the drive.
You said one very interesting thing, dream matches, fantasy bookings. Did you get some of his fantasy bookings out of him when he sat there on the back row in the church school?
We spoke about it, and right now, I'm sorry, I'm not remembering. We were talking about people like Brad Armstrong. We were talking about the Midnight Express. We were speaking about the Rock and Roll Express. The very athletic wrestlers who, to a degree, might be known for some high flying, but they're also technically sound. And look, that's what you're seeing in AEW to a large extent.
Exactly. So Tony Khan going from sitting in school and creating his own wrestling promotion. How did that came about? Because that's quite a long journey, Keith.
It is. And Tony Khan, he worked in the family business and he's been involved in sports management and analytics. And he also has kept an eye on the sports television landscape, both in the UK and the US, because that's where his father's businesses are centered. The family businesses are centered. And so at a certain stage, in many ways, this book is an extension of the book I wrote in 2020, which is called Too Sweet Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution. Indie wrestling had been extremely popular as an alternative to particularly European and North American fans, I'd say from around 2012 on. Even in Japan, that was when the Hiroshi Tanahashi era really began in New Japan. And so there was this alternative to WWE, who some fans felt was the corporate wrestler that they were being exposed to, and they wanted something more. And Tony Khan, was one of those fans. So, you had the Bullet Club, and you had guys like Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks, and Cody Rhodes, who had left WWE, and they're crossing boundaries. They're going to different promotions and they're going to different countries and they're, incorporating different styles. And, Kenny Omega explained to me, not just different ring styles when it comes to, international promotions, but Kenny Omega told me he wants to be the best trios wrestler. He wants to be the best singles wrestler. He wants to be the best tag team specialist. And this is, a very unique perspective. And Tony Khan is keeping an eye on this. And then we get to the original All In, which was not an AEW project. It was actually affiliated with Ring of Honor, the Ring of Honor that was owned by Sinclair Broadcasting, not the Tony Khan Ring. And there's a belief, a fiction, that Tony Khan was in the audience at that first All In, and he had an epiphany like St. Paul on the road to Damascus and decided, I'm going to start this wrestling promotion. But that's not true. Tony Khan already intended to start another wrestling promotions. In fact, by the first All In, and I'm talking about, again, the Ring of Honor, Indie All In, he already had hired his first employee for what would become AEW. And he had had discussions with television executives, and he was thinking of networks where AEW could run. And as an homage to what came before, he particularly wanted to work with the Turner networks in the United States because that's where the WCW had run. And he wanted to work with ITV in the UK because that's where the World of Sport broadcast had come from. And so, and again, this is a man who had resources and drive. And by the time that first All In takes place, word is circulating on the indie circuit that there's this guy who has a lot of money, more money than they've ever met from someone who's an aspiring indie promoter. And he might be interested in using it. And, the Young Bucks told me this. Lots of people said this. It's like they've heard this all before. You're on this circuit. There's always some guy who claims he has a lot of money and he wants to start a wrestling promotion. And it's like, all right. And then he's going to run out of money after the first 2 or 3 months. And then, you're going to burn some bridges if you make a commitment. Tony Khan really was sincere and he wasn't going to give up. And I think at first, I can't remember which member of the Young Bucks he persuaded first. But
wasn't it Matt, actually?
It was Matt. And then Matt persuaded Nick, and Nick persuaded Cody. And and again, there's the Elite. They're traveling as a pack around the world. And that leads to Kenny Omega knowing that. And that leads to Hangman Page knowing that. And, they're wrestling in Ring of Honor. So SoCal Uncensored is a hot tag team at the time. And, now the word is, and then you have indie wrestlers like Jungle Boy Jack Perry and MJF and, wants to be part of the original All In. And he works the pre-show and does a job. He loses and he's thrilled. He goes, now people are going to see who I am. Those are Darby Allin. Those are the people who would become stars. And it's all laid out in this book, how we got to where we are today.
Yes, it's quite so interesting, Keith. But going from that idea in Tony Khan's head, when you talk with Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks, did they really believe that 5 years after they were going to stand at Wembley Stadium with over...
Wembley Stadium, and I don't think Tony Khan was making grandiose promises because that's a very grandiose promise. Like, if you say, hey, we're going to have a show at Wembley Stadium and draw more than 80,000 fans, then you sound like you're insane or you're delusional. And so he wasn't saying that, but he said, we're going to be a viable wrestling. And, he was offering the type of money that persuaded them, hey, you know what? I'll sign with Tony Khan instead of New Japan. See how it goes. I could always go back there. I won't re-sign with Ring of Honor. Little did anyone know Tony Khan would eventually buy Ring of Honor.
Yeah, exactly. But the skepticism must have been quite huge at the start of all this.
Of course it was huge. And it's the wrestling business. And it's a business full of carnies. So, of course, nobody ever believes what they're promised. And most of the time, people go back on their promises.
Exactly. How did Tony Khan handle all this? Because he had a huge wrestling mind and did a lot of stuff. And how did he manage to handle all these thoughts, getting all those contracts? Because it must have been a huge work only when you told me just hiring one man.
Yeah. I mean, look, he was assisted from the beginning. His first employee is Chris Harrington, who, people wouldn't know his name off the top of their head, but he's the business expert. And he was writing about the business of professional wrestling, so you might see his name. And at first you'd say, he's some internet wrestling writer. Then you're reading it. It's like, I don't know. This is pretty detailed stuff. This guy knows a lot about the wrestling business. And I guess Tony Khan was able to spot a kindred spirit. This guy loves wrestling the way I do, but he's not a marginal person. He's a legitimate person. And Chris Harrington's wife is an attorney, an accomplished attorney, and she came on board as well. So there was definitely a family element, but I don't think it was a dysfunctional family in the sense that many wrestling promotions have traditionally been.
Yeah, so it was creating some kind of new family.
New family and a new movement. Or it latched itself onto a movement that existed, but other than the original All In, it was.
Okay, but Tony Khan as a wrestling figure, Tony Khan as a wrestling promoter, and going from that, hiring his first employee, Chris Harrington, Chris Harrington's wife, and standing on that parking lot announcing All Elite Wrestling. How did Tony Khan give you an insight to that process? Because,
well, look, I mean, the parking lot was in Jacksonville, and it was on property that the Khan family already owned. Again, when I was a kid, I don't know, I thought about being a wrestler. Did I think about owning a wrestling promotion? If my father had been a sports owner, I probably would have. So, it'd be nice to have a father who owns Madison Square Garden or Wembley Stadium. You can have a press conference there. So it's not that absurd that he could do it in the parking lot of a stadium that his family owns.
No, but it sounds a little bit humble, actually.
Well, I think he Tony Khan years ago, when he was a kid, he would call in ring results to Dave Meltzer's Wrestling Observer newsletter. Like a lot of us. I mean, he was a fan. He wanted to be involved any way he could. And he also understood that there was a lot of chicanery in professional wrestling. That, because people expected the business ethics of the carnival midway. And I believe he was determined to be the exception.
Interesting. So did Tony Khan tell you anything about the feeling that went through him when they announced All Elite Wrestling?
Well, he was anxious to announce it. There was some, 2019, New Year's Eve, 12 p.m. Pacific time in the U.S. and Canada. That was when they announced it. The moment it was 2019. And, among the executive vice presidents, the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega and Cody Rhodes, there was some differences in when do we start announcing upcoming shows. Tony Khan was the one who wanted to emphasize we start now. Like, we're not waiting now. People have been waiting for this. There's been rumors about it. Here it is, midnight. It's New Year's Eve. Now AEW begins. And there was excitement and, of course, an enormous amount of nervousness.
Yes, so going from announcing it and now looking back 5 years later as Wembley as a lighthouse of everything that they have accomplished. That first steps, how did he came about? I want to do this, and putting together his first match card?
Well, he had to sign the wrestlers. And then once he had those wrestlers signed, now he could do what he always did. He could do fantasy booking. Here's what, I just watched a match, MJF and Brody King. It's like, all right, what do we do with Brody King and MJF? And what about if MJF gets distracted and Brody King gets him from behind and holds him over the ring apron and chokes him and, chokes him out and knocks him out? If you have Brody King and MJF, you can do that match. And he had that. And, the building blocks were in place. The television exposure was in place, where the streaming outlets were in place, where you could start promoting the brand. And, Tony Khan had spent a lot of time in London regularly because he's still involved with Fulham Football Club. And so, the family owns Craven Cottage, Fulham Stadium, but I think Wembley is symbolic. I mean, WrestleMania SummerSlam in 1992 was, an event that, will loom like if there's a list of the 5 greatest, most inspirational cards in history. I'd put WrestleMania 3 because I wrote a book about it. I'd say we put Wembley because that really was this symbolism of WWE opening up to the whole European market. And Tony Khan wanted to be at that level. And so it's like, okay, it's been, 1992 is when there was a big wrestling show at Wembley Stadium. Now we're going to be at the stadium. The enthusiasm exists.
But there's a lot, in your book, a lot of chapters. One of those chapters that really, I think, should have been hard for you to write is the chapter about Brody King.
Yes, Brody Lee. I mean, Brody Lee, he'd been playing a silent backwoods character in WWE. And, the people who knew him knew he was a great speaker. And then he comes in as the boss of the Dark Order. And he has this great match with Cody Rhodes and he wins the TNT title. And then he disappears from television. As a fan, I'm thinking, they're going to give his character retooling. Meanwhile, he was quite ill. And this is remarkable to me that in this decade, this could take place. The wrestlers and the crew at AEW were aware of how sick he was. And they actually managed to keep it quiet. And it never made it to the internet. And that was out of respect to Brody Lee's family. And, this is one of those things that no matter what you say about AEW and the people who've performed there, every single person involved with the company at that time should be deeply respected for doing that, for, their brothers and sisters in the wrestling business, and for us, because we didn't need to hear gossip. We needed to go through that when the family was ready for us to experience that.
Exactly. And that period was actually quite special because it was the COVID period.
Yes, it was.
And all AEW surviving that period. And one of the matches that really stood out to me was the Stadium Stampede.
Yes. And again, that maybe is probably my favorite match of the pandemic era. And you look, both companies and the indies had to get extremely creative during that period. I mean, I also wrote a book, Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19, about that era. There was one indie promotion in San Diego that were doing these clandestine shows in parking lots when people were supposed to be quarantined. And they were sending information. You'd have to get in your car. And they had a special frequency on your FM dial. You'd tune to it, and they would give you instructions on how to get there. So, it's very unique. And, WWE eventually created the Thunderdome, which was the ring surrounded by LED screens, which looked pretty cool when you're stuck at home. And AEW, they harkened back to the studio wrestling days where the audiences were small. But they would have the other wrestlers sit in the audience and make a lot of noise. And they were spread apart. Remember, there was social distancing. And so you would hear people very enthusiastically screaming during these matches. And it created an ambiance that was very authentic. But the Stadium Stampede, again, this involves Tony Khan's family owning the Jacksonville Jaguars. And they had an entire American football stadium to use. And, the Chris Jericho and the Young Bucks, they're all telling me they walk in and they're looking around and, they're like, all right, well, we have a goalpost over here. We have, the second tier over there. Maybe someone can jump off of that. We have cheerleaders. Oh, look, we have sprinklers and we have, these different vehicles that we can drive around. How do we make a crazy match out of it? And they did it on the fly. And again, it wasn't live. So they had 24 hours to shoot it, and they used the whole 24 hours, and then they had to edit it together.
Well, that's amazing. But so actually they did that match on the fly. There wasn't anything scripted or anything.
I would say there were discussions, but Chris Jericho said it was really when they were in the stadium where they started brainstorming. Well, what about this? Well, what else do we have in the stadium? There's a bar here. Let's do a barroom brawl. Well, it's American football, and American football, the referee will make a call and someone will dispute it. Well, let's have somebody dispute a call with the referee, and the referee will look at the replay and will overrule the player. And, there was that moment where Chris Jericho goes to Aubrey Edwards. You're a shitty referee. They have the sprinklers go on. And, I think it was Sammy Guevara who was scored by the sprinklers. And, there's 100 yards on an American football field. So there was a Northern Light suplex that was said to go on for 100 yards. I mean, it was cutting away. So I'm not sure suplexing took place for an entire, 100 yards, but it was sure cool to be watching other things happening. And now they're at the 70 yard.
Yeah. So that's one of the great matches that AEW have done. They have done a lot. And one thing that was also very unique, actually been tried before in a smaller scale, Forbidden Door.
Yes. And Forbidden Door was the merging of AEW with different promotions. Now, look, Ring of Honor had a relationship with, I believe was it AAA at the time? It was AAA in Mexico and with, New Japan. So this wasn't unprecedented. And for years, WWE, when it was the WWF and WWF, had a very close relationship with New Japan. In fact, the president of New Japan was the figurehead president of WWF. But we were so accustomed, particularly with WWE, to seeing that company depicted as a monolith, independent of everything else that was going on in the wrestling world, as if nothing else mattered. And Tony Khan decided and realized they were also working with TNA. So it's like, well, let's form these alliances and incorporate it into our own wrestling. And the fans had a hunger for that. And let's see what's going on in the wrestling world now. WWE, the company that owns WWE, owns AAA now in Mexico. And they also have a relationship with Noah in Japan. So the Forbidden Door has now crossed, over to the other side.
Was that Forbidden Door idea something that Tony Khan has always wanted to do?
Yes, certainly. Certainly. I mean, look, how many times have you hung out with wrestling fans and, when different promotions aren't cooperating and, you're fantasizing. It's like, hey, wouldn't it be great if the Young Bucks came to WWE and they had a match against the New Day? I'm just thinking off the top of my head. How cool would that be? And, that would be, or the Street Profits. And, Tony Khan was like, again, that's fantasy booking. Let's take talent from other promotions and bring them in fantasy book. And now WW, you just watched the Royal Rumble. You had Misty Iguana in there, and you have Dominic Mysterio as of today as the AAA Mega Champion, and you also have, while we're speaking about things of that nature, let's look at the talent in NXT and WWE. You have people like Ricky Saints and Blake Monroe. Those are all people who came over from AEW. You had CM Punk in AEW, and now CM Punk is back in WWE and he's wearing a title. And you had Cody Rhodes, who never quite made it at the level he was satisfied with in WWE. And now he may be arguably the biggest star in the company. And, so in some ways, the Forbidden Door even crosses over between rivals, even though they're not planning it together.
That's actually one thing that's amazing. And you could talk a lot about AEW's influence on the wrestling landscape of today, but they have opened up a lot of doors, not just forbidden, but also opened doors and opened eyes to other styles of wrestling.
Yes. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No.
But I can remember when I was working on the indie wrestling book, I'd go to a Game Changer wrestling show, GCW, and you'd have a death match. I remember I saw Darby Allin there, and you'd have a technical match, and you'd have a comedy match, and you'd have an intergender match. And that was all part of the presentation on the indies. But there was this feeling that you couldn't really present that mainstream because some of the stuff was too fringe. And it's like rap music or gangster rap. Well, what's fringe becomes mainstream. Jazz music was fringe at one time. The tango was fringe. Italian gangsters in Argentina were dancing the tango. Now the tango is something people's great-grandmothers danced to in the nursing.
Exactly. And that's what wrestling is today.
It's art.
Everything. It's art. It's a piece of art. It's
right.
a story that every wrestler tells with their body in the ring.
Right. And that's what it's physical theater.
Yes.
And, recently I'm switching over to WWE, but I was watching John Cena's final match with someone who wasn't a wrestling fan. And she said to me, this is strange to me because she hadn't watched wrestling since she was a little girl. And she's like, the fans today obviously know it's theater. They don't think this is a real fight, but they're crying. And it's like, well, if you watch a television series or a great movie and you go to a conclusion that's a little bit heartbreaking, you cry too. This person on screen didn't really die, but it still impacts you. And that's what these men and women do, regardless of company, regardless of their level of fame. They do in the ring with their bodies and their facial expressions and their promos. And that is why pro wrestling is beautiful.
Yeah, we could talk about that for hours, Keith.
And we will at some point.
Yeah, we will for sure. Let's rewind it a little bit because AEW have created some new huge stars. One of those stars that's top of my mind is someone like
MJF. And, it's, I don't keep this a secret. I went to high school with MJF's mother. and that wasn't in Long Island. It was in Queens, New York. It was in the city of New York, by the way. And it was funny because one of her friends, I don't remember ever talking to Nina, his mother, in high school, but we were obviously at times in the same place because my best friend dated one of her good friends. And so that was a nice connection. But here's MJF trying to get a spot at the original All In. And then he tells me that, they have the press conference to launch AEW. And they let him do some heel shtick where he comes out and he, tries to bust the whole thing up. And then Joey Janela, I think, is dressed as the Jaguars mascot, beats him down. And MJF is overjoyed, like, wow, I'm part of this thing. And then MJF tells me he goes backstage. And at this point, they hadn't announced that Chris Jericho would be involved. And he sees Chris Jericho and he's like, now he's a fan. He's like, oh my God, Chris Jericho is here. I can't believe it.
That's interesting because MJF is actually one of maybe the biggest star now in AEW. So they have really created something unique with him.
Yeah. And then you look at people and look, she actually trained at the same school as MJF. Willow Nightingale. She's not, internationally known. She's not a household name, but she's pretty cool wrestler. Good athlete, very likable in the ring. I never look away from one of her matches. And you have Harley Cameron. They're, as of today, as of this, podcast day when we're speaking, they're tag team champions. And Harley Cameron and I've discussed this with people at AEW, she was there before, but now that personality has truly come out. So all of these new stars have been created. Darby Allin would anyone would have given him a serious look if it weren't for Tony Khan? Sure, on the indie level, absolutely. But now he's taken very seriously. And I'm sure he is influencing wrestlers everywhere.
Exactly. And also, Tony Khan took some of former WWE stars to AEW.
Yes,
and we
he
have
did.
two, actually, besides Chris Jericho. We have John Moxley and we have Bryan Danielson. Those
Bryan
two.
Danielson. And look, you needed, and this was explained to me, as AEW was on its mission to get people to know the product and get sponsors and licensees to invest in the product. They couldn't do it just with MJF and, Dr. Britt Baker, because those were not international names. But John Moxley was, and Chris Jericho was, and Bryan Danielson was. So in order for this movement to spread, they needed somebody to look up at a television somewhere or see an article somewhere or look at their phone and say, I know this guy. I know Bryan Danielson is Daniel Bryan. Let me check it out. And you had to supplement those names with the new names and introduce Jack Perry and Darby Allin and MJF and Dr. Britt Baker. And look, even I consider Mercedes Moné one of those people who jumped over to AEW. And at first, as a fan, I was like, I'm not so sure if she can adjust to the new. And now I think Mercedes Moné on her own, I'll never diminish what Sasha Banks accomplished, but Mercedes Moné on her own is a really big star. And I think you can make an argument that she may be better off just as a performer there. And Ricochet is fantastic. We always knew he was. I remember seeing him years ago on the Indies. But now Ricochet, I never knew he could speak like that.
But probably one thing that was huge. How did Tony Khan convince CM Punk to come back?
I wasn't there for those discussions. I think everybody in wrestling is like this. It's funny, like AJ Styles just retired. Could he really be retired? He's in such great shape and he's wrestling at such a high level. Could he really walk away from the business? And CM Punk had said he was done with the business, but it was hard to imagine that he could just close that door and have nothing to do with it. And I guess he was watching what was going on, and there were probably I'm sure there were financial considerations. And I guess there were also creative considerations. And for a brief window, it worked. And I would now say it served both parties. It served AEW because it attracted more eyes to the product. And despite the unfortunate circumstances that led to CM Punk's departure, it served CM Punk because look at where it brought him in WWE afterwards.
Exactly. And that's a much better angle to the development and the departure of CM Punk from AEW instead of focusing on all the other stuff that's not quite interesting. One tag team and one wrestler that's very, very close to my heart. Probably, in my eyes, the best wrestler in the world, Kenny Omega.
Yes, and Kenny Omega, look, outside of WWE, everyone knew how great Kenny Omega was. And I can remember doing a project for WWE and saying, that I'm telling someone from inside of WWE that I'd watched Wrestle Kingdom and that I'd seen Omega against Jericho. And, the guy in WWE going, I have to check that out. I've heard so much about it. People have been buzzing about it. This is like backstage, not in the spotlight, but people are talking about it. And, he was known as the best bout machine for a reason. Tony Khan got him. And that is a big feather to have, because Kenny Omega is considered the best wrestler of his time. Just like, Tanahashi, who just retired at Wrestle Kingdom, is considered the best wrestler of that era in Japan. New Japan would not have gotten where it was, and I would say AEW would not have become what it was without Tanahashi. And Tony Khan needed those big names, not just because it was status, because it gave credibility to fans who took the product seriously and to wrestlers thinking, I want to be somewhere where this art is perceived at the level that I perceive.
And probably we maybe should do an episode about Kenny Omega sometime because I could watch him wrestle for hours.
Yes. Yes. And, look, Kenny Omega is one of those guys that I've thought to myself, if I ever had surgery, which I'm not going to talk about the type of surgery, but I just did have surgery. And I always say, oh, this is what I would do to kill time. I was like, oh, I'd watch like Kenny Omega's matches, say from 2007 onward, everyone I can get. Then by the time I watched them all and studied them and pondered them, I'd be ready to walk around. It turns out I had surgery last week, but, I'm doing this. I wrote an article. I had other things to do. I worked on some non-wrestling projects. I wasn't able to sit there and just power watch Kenny Omega matches, but it sure sounds satisfying.
Yeah. He's amazing. And then the tag team, the Young Bucks,
right?
Part of the Elite.
Yeah, and the Young Bucks, when I wrote the book on indie wrestling, the thing that inspired me was going to WrestleMania 34, I believe, in New Orleans, and seeing all these Bullet Club shirts as I was walking around the city. And I'm like, this is a WWE entity, the Bullet Club, but the fans were into it. That's what Tony Khan saw. And, that's because of the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, of course, and Cody Rhodes. But they were, they have just done things as a tag team that very few have ever done. And they've played villains and heroes just as effectively. And, you have to say, you watch their matches now, it's as if those guys are still in their 20s.
It's actually crazy.
Yes, it's crazy. And I spoke about AJ Styles before. It's like watching him recently and thinking, this is a man who's nearly 50 years old. I cannot believe the daily punishment these guys have put themselves through. And they still perform at such a high level. And they're still inspiring kids who are going to become wrestlers.
Exactly. But the end of the book ends with the Wembley show, and we met before that. And I think that's the lighthouse of this book, a perfect ending, one could say.
Yes.
So when did Tony Khan get the idea, I want to go to Wembley? I can sell out Wembley.
He always wanted to go to the UK, and he kept the product away from the UK. So no one had seen AEW in the UK. I mean, you and I met there.
Yeah.
And you remember what it was like to walk to that stadium from the tube. And I was listening to people speaking. I was listening to people speaking, French, German. I was listening to people speaking Greek. And I mean, this was, this was like a Woodstock almost of, wrestling fans from all over Europe. Tony Khan knew that if you had the talent and you created this big event, people would come to it. And it was quite a culmination of his success. And it was his answer to everyone who downplayed what AEW might be. All those people who said, they'll be out of business in a year. AEW is not going out of business. You talk about television contracts and things that can go wrong. They probably will never overtake WWE, but AEW will always be there. And as wrestling fans, we're fortunate, I believe, to have both of them.
I would say we are more than fortunate. We are blessed with the landscape of wrestling today.
Yes.
And that's so unique. And I could not say thank you enough to Tony Khan for actually doing this and running with that torch and taking AEW to where it is today.
And, Tony Khan, fortunately, AEW is small enough that Tony Khan is still able to get out there where there are fans. When this book came out, Tony Khan and Orange Cassidy, who's another guy we could talk about, took place, went to a book signing together. And so fans were able to walk right up to Tony Khan and thank him and explain what his dream has meant to them. And, I know as companies get bigger, sometimes you become removed from those interactions, but I hope it doesn't happen to Tony Khan for a while.
Exactly. So, Keith, we could go on talking for hours, but if you should take 3 things that you think are the most important part in this book.
Well, certainly the backstory of how AEW was founded, what was really going on behind the scenes, and how one by one Tony Khan was convincing these people to sign with an unknown company of the pandemic era, and how AEW was able to create these indelible memories during a period that was, a dark period in every way. And then, what we just discussed, Wembley. How do you go from being a startup to selling out Wembley Stadium? And then you continue on and you're not a fluke.
So, Keith, before closing this interview, where can people buy this amazing book?
Well, I would say at this stage, just go online and type in This Book Is All Elite by Keith Elliot Greenberg, and you'll be able to get the book. I wish we could do a Danish version.
Yeah, actually, but I don't think I have the time to translate it. I think it would be so. Maybe
wouldn't it be fun? Yeah,
we could talk with someone if you come over in September.
Yeah.
You could have your own stand.
I always thought it'd be fun to do like versions of my book, but like in Gaelic, in Welsh, like in like what was the language in the Czech Republic where I can't remember it, where Andy Warhol's family spoke it, like these languages that are just confined to small regions.
Yeah. And maybe actually you should, if you're coming over in September, you could, if you ever speak to Tony Khan, you can tell him that he's more than welcome to come to Denmark.
Yes, I would tell him that.
Yeah. So Keith, thank you so much for the time, and it's always a pleasure talking to you. So, and everybody out there that's interested in AEW, you have to buy Keith Elliot Greenberg's book. This book is all elite.
All right. Well, thank you so much.